UN reports have consistently reiterated the need for urgent corporate action to help ensure we meet the Paris Agreement, including halving emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. Businesses have responded to calls for action, proactively addressing the risks and opportunities of climate change by setting an ever-increasing number of science-based targets and net zero commitments. For example, nearly 4,000 companies have set a science-based target or made a net zero commitment through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Yet, commitments alone are not enough. Expectations are growing for a transparent, near-term plans for how a company will make the necessary progress against these commitments. These plans, commonly referred to as climate transition action plans, can help by making the path on this challenging transition very clear. The paramount message here is that the only thing that really matters to the climate is action. The ultimate measure of a climate transition action plan is whether it helps speed a company on their climate journey. Transition plans are known by many different names: Climate Transition Action Plan, Net Zero Transition Plan, Climate Action Plan, and so on. But at their core, they are a framework to create and communicate key elements of a company's climate strategies and near-term actions to stakeholders like investors, governments, NGOs, and the general public. There is a plethora of guidance on transition plans right now from a range of organizations targeted to various sectors or audiences, leading to confusion and uncertainty around how to proceed. EDF recently worked with the We Mean Business Coalition, Ceres, and CDP to analyze over 30 of these guides to consolidate guidance and identify the most critical elements that companies should be considering in their plans. This session highlights a consolidated approach that can be followed by a range of companies. This report, with accompanying resources like a checklist worksheet, was published in November 2022. In this report, CTAPs were defined as a, quote, forward-looking list of actions taken in the near term to align internal strategies and external policy advocacy to reduce emissions in line with a 1.5-degree pathway and achieve a just transition. They are not meant to be just another form of backward-looking disclosure, but instead a roadmap for a company's near-term future. You might still be wondering, why do I need a transition plan? Demand for a clear net zero plan is coming from key stakeholders, including employees, customers who want to understand how a company is taking action, but also investors, voluntary standards, and increasingly governments. The investor community is signaling interest in transparent transition plans through initiatives like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, known as GFANZ, which also has published guidance for companies on investor expectations for transition plans. Major voluntary initiatives like the UN's Race to Zero have added transition plan publication as a key requirement for a robust net zero strategy. And this is quickly looking to be mandatory in some geographies. For example, the UK will require companies to produce transition plans, setting up a high-level task force to steer high-quality disclosure. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, signed into law at the end of November, will also require disclosure around climate plans and activities. In the recent We Mean Business report, we identified 4 core simplified components that should be inquired in all CTAPs. First is an emissions reduction strategy. In other words, what are the near-term actions your company is taking to reduce emissions in line with a 1.5-degree future? For example, have you set a long-term and interim target in line with guidance from organizations like SBTi or the UN's Race to Zero? Second is information on governance and business strategy integration. In other words, how is your company addressing climate-related risks and opportunities, and how are you aligning governance to meet climate goals? This generally aligns with reporting done through frameworks like TCFD. The third is public policy. How is your company advocating for and aligning lobbying and trade association activities with a 1.5C future? Finally, the fourth is just transition. How are you supporting your existing workforce, suppliers, and customers in the climate transition? There are other helpful summary guidance documents that have been recently released. For example, Transform to Net Zero, a coalition of 10 leading companies and EDF, gave a company perspective on what a good CTAP looks like. They identified 11 key elements of a CTAP, layering on specificity around integrating climate into financial planning, value chain engagement, that strategy, and also what low carbon initiatives should look like while emphasizing transparency. But it can boil down to these four critical elements. These Transform to Net Zero points can be seen as a more detailed summary overview as compared to the We Mean Business approach. Many companies are already reporting pieces of CTAP information in ESG disclosures, CDP reports, or sustainability reports, while others may be starting from scratch. Transition plans are just one piece of the accountability puzzle. They rely on a foundation of science-based goals and must be paired with reporting to measure progress against them. This holistic approach is a feedback loop giving you the insight necessary to build and adjust your strategy. No matter where you are in your climate journey, you have the tools and resources available to get started on developing a robust plan. For the rest of this session, we'll focus on two key elements of CTAP. First, building the foundation, and second, creating an emissions reduction plan. First, we'll focus on developing the foundation for your transition plan. It might sound obvious to say, but a climate transition action plan requires a clear and detailed understanding of what you're transitioning to. In other words, your long-term net zero target. It's no longer enough to only commit to distant mid-century targets. Transition plans require detailed, specific, robust, and comprehensive information about commitments. For example, climate goals should cover all three emissions scopes and all major greenhouse gases. And a reminder that slashing methane is particularly urgent priority for sectors like energy and food and agriculture. Goals need to be ambitious, aligning with a science-based pathway to keep warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, such as those identified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And importantly for CTAPs, this all needs to be backed by near-term science-based targets to cut emissions drastically by 2030, when we need emissions cuts the most. Now we'll talk through how to begin to develop an emissions reduction strategy. Developing a strategy that can be easily communicated to stakeholders is a central and fundamental component of CTAP. This answers the questions of where are my biggest emission sources? What are the levers available to me? And which levers am I going to pull to reduce my emissions in line with my near and long-term goals? Ideally, companies should develop an emissions reduction strategy based on a comprehensive, detailed, and ideally third-party verified greenhouse gas emissions inventory. This is commonly done in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and there are increasingly software providers and tools available to simplify this process. Some are listed here. This inventory will show you your emissions hotspots, in other words, your priorities for action, and critically point you in the direction of the levers available to you to reduce emissions. Importantly, while measuring the emissions footprint, companies must begin acting on the biggest emissions reductions opportunities now. This is based on basic information about the sector and type of company and baseline operational knowledge you have of your emission sources, such as energy and fleets. You might be asking, which levers am I going to pull to reduce my emissions in line with my near and long-term goals? The priorities for action and emissions reduction solutions available will vary substantially by sector given the emissions profile. For example, the emissions hotspots will look extremely different for a technology company who might have high electricity consumption in data centers versus a dairy company with high methane emissions from livestock. Thus, opportunities for reduction will vary significantly between the two organizations. EDF's Pathways to Net Zero Decisive Decade report outlined a simple 4-part framework for thinking through how to get started and prioritize near-term solutions. This includes an identify step, a map step, evaluate, and prioritize. I'll walk you through these 4 steps now. First, the identify step, where you need to identify a range of abatement solutions relevant to your industry and company across scopes 1, 2, and 3. These solutions are commonly things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, fleet upgrades, and electrification. There are many places to look for potential solutions. This includes the US EPA's Center for Corporate Climate Leadership, climate action pathways developed by the UNFCCC, or organizations like Project Drawdown. Sector-specific industry groups or sustainability associations may also have additional solutions specific to your organization as well. The next step is to map solutions that are already identified to the primary drivers of emissions to develop a short list of high-impact solutions. For example, if you've identified electricity consumption and livestock methane emissions as key hotspots, you'd likely have an energy efficiency program and renewable energy procurement to mitigate electricity-related emissions and changes in feed mix or dietary additives or manure management to mitigate methane emissions. It's important to note at a certain point in the process, you'll need to estimate the abatement potential of each solution. In other words, how much does this reduce emissions, or how close does this get me to my goals? Next is the evaluate step. There are always going to be unique benefits and drawbacks to the potential solutions, and these can be challenging to navigate. For example, a solution like developing emissions performance requirements for suppliers seems ideal to address Scope 3 emissions. But maybe you know that the procurement team at your company is facing severe supply chain constraints due to a global crisis, and you won't be able to implement this in the short term. You might want to look at this possible solution and map it against others to determine which is best to move forward now. So how do you look at the full list of abatement solutions and start to do this process of prioritizing on advantages and constraints? One solution is developing standardized criteria and quantitative scoring systems. This can help in evaluating solutions and balancing priorities. While these kinds of exercise will always be subjective and informed by leadership preferences, sustainability strategy, and corporate values, you can rely on set criteria to at least give direction to your decision-making process. For example, you can group criteria and evaluation questions by 4 buckets. First, emissions abatement. How big is the potential reduction? Second, business value. How does this contribute to risks and opportunities? Third, cost and feasibility. How much does this cost and how feasible is it with current capacity? And finally, equity and justice. How does this contribute positively or negatively to community impacts? Assigning quantitative scores under these criteria for each potential abatement solution can provide a path forward for identifying which solutions to implement. EDF recently published a new interactive scorecard tool that lets you input abatement solutions, score them, and get a prioritized scorecard to help make some of these decisions. This tool also includes a full list of questions and scoring criteria under the 4 buckets I just listed. Finally, we're on to the prioritize step. You'll need to take these evaluated solutions and determine which ones you want to implement. To determine this, you can think about how they score in terms of the criteria we just discussed, keeping in mind feasibility, potential limitations, and the total emissions reductions you'll need to achieve. Not every solution may be ready for prime time right now. If they're not, consider how public policy advocacy or other avenues like pre-competitive competition can help unlock the path forward. The result of a process like this can form the basis of a CTAP, helping to clearly communicate your company's decarbonization plan. But it's worth remembering that a robust action plan isn't just carbon-focused. It's also accompanied by key details around governance and just transition. All of these elements give your stakeholders a holistic view as to how your company is approaching climate risks and opportunities. Remember, be ambitious in your plans, keeping in mind key emissions targets for 2030 and 2050 and the need for immediate action. But be transparent, act with integrity, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in making progress towards your targets. For further resources, consult the new report from We Mean Business Coalition CDP series in EDF called Climate Transition Action Plans: Activate Your Journey to Climate Leadership, as well as EDF's Pathways to Net Zero series of reports. Thank you so much.